I watched my 17-year-old niece scrubbing dishes at midnight on Christmas Eve. Her college acceptance letter crumpled in the trash behind her. I grabbed the manager by his collar and told him exactly what I thought of men who exploit desperate children. What I discovered next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own family. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up 6 hours to explain how I ended up in the worst diner in Cleveland, watching my brother's daughter destroy her future one dirty plate at a time. You see, I hadn't spoken to my sister Sarah in 3 years, not since our last explosive argument about money, pride, and what family really means. But Christmas has a way of making even stubborn businessmen do stupid, sentimental things. The GPS led me through neighborhoods that got worse with every turn. I'd driven here from my penthouse in Manhattan, carrying guilt-wrapped presents and practicing apologies I'd never be good enough to deliver. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah had thrown my business card at me and told me she'd rather starve than take pity money from her successful little brother. Well, the joke was on both of us now, because I was standing in front of a rundown duplex that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Clinton administration. The lawn was more dirt than grass, and someone had duct-taped plastic over a broken window. This was where my sister lived. This was where my niece Emma was supposed to be studying for her senior year. I knocked on the door, holding a bottle of wine that probably cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Not that I'd planned it that way, but everything in my world came with a price tag that reminded you exactly how different we'd become. Mark answered the door. My brother-in-law looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 3 since I'd seen him. His factory worker's hands were stained with grease that never quite washed out, and his smile was the kind you give someone at a funeral. Grateful, but exhausted. "Will," he said, like he was trying to convince himself I was real. "Sarah didn't think you'd actually come." "Well, here I am," I replied, because brilliant conversation has always been my specialty. "Merry Christmas, Mark." He stepped aside to let me in, and I tried not to react to what I saw. The living room was clean but sparse, the kind of clean that comes from not having enough stuff to make a mess. No Christmas tree. A few dollar store decorations hung with the determined cheer of people who refuse to let circumstances define their holidays. "She's in the kitchen," Mark said quietly. Will, she's not the Sarah you remember." That should have been my first real warning, but I was too busy rehearsing my speech about family and forgiveness to pay attention to the fear in his voice. I found Sarah standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like home and hope. When she turned around, I understood what Mark meant. My sister had always been the pretty one, the one who turned heads and made people smile just by walking into a room. The woman facing me was a shadow wrapped in loose clothing, trying to hide the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. "Hello, Willie," she said, using the nickname she knew I hated. Some things never change. "Hello, Sarah." I held up the wine. "Peace offering?" She looked at the bottle like it might explode. "That's a 2018 Chateau Margaux. You always did pay attention in those wine classes you took. This costs more than our car payment." And there it was. The elephant that had been sitting in every room we'd shared for the past decade. Money. The thing that had built a wall between us so high we needed GPS to find each other. "Where's Emma?" I asked, changing the subject before we could start the same fight we'd been having since I made my first $1,000,000. Sarah's face did something complicated. Pride and worry and something else I couldn't identify fought for control of her expression. "She's out. Working." "Working? It's Christmas Eve. Some people don't get holidays off," Mark said from the doorway, and there was an edge to his voice that made my successful businessman instincts start paying attention. I looked around the kitchen more carefully. No dishwasher, no microwave, a refrigerator that wheezed like it was taking its last breath. And on the counter, next to a stack of bills, I saw something that made my chest tight. Prescription bottles. Lots of them. "Sarah," I said carefully, "are you sick?" The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Mark looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the floor. And I looked at my sister. Really looked. And saw what pride had been hiding. The loose clothes weren't a fashion choice. They were covering weight loss she couldn't afford. The shaking hands weren't nerves. the careful way she moved, like her joints were made of glass. "It's lupus," she said finally, the words coming out flat and hard. "Diagnosed 4 months ago. The aggressive kind that likes to move fast and break things." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What does that mean? Treatment-wise? "It means," Mark said, his voice carefully controlled, "that insurance companies think experimental treatments are suggestions, not necessities. It means the medicine that works costs more than we make in 6 months." "How much?" "Will, don't." "How much, Sarah?" She lifted her chin, and for a second, she looked like the stubborn little girl who used to steal my baseball cards and dare me to do something about it. $1,200 a month, plus the specialist visits, plus the tests they need to monitor. She waved a hand like she was swatting away details that were too expensive to matter. $1,200. I spent more than that on lunch meetings. I spent more than that on ties I'd wear once. I spent more than that without thinking. Every single day. "And Emma?" I asked, though I was starting to understand why my 17-year-old niece wasn't home studying on Christmas Eve. "Emma is—" Sarah's voice cracked, and Mark moved to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders like he could hold her together through sheer force of will. "Emma is trying to save us all." That's when I knew I needed to find my niece. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 20 years of business, it's that when someone says they're trying to save everyone, they're usually destroying themselves in the process. Mark gave me the address with the reluctance of a man handing over state secrets. "The Sunrise Diner on East 55th, he said. "But Will, please don't." She's embarrassed enough. Embarrassed. My niece, who'd been valedictorian material the last time I'd checked, was working at a diner on Christmas Eve, and was embarrassed about it. The cold thing in my stomach turned into something harder and angrier. I'd driven through worse neighborhoods during my climb up the corporate ladder, but I'd never paid attention to them the way I did now. Every boarded window and broken streetlight felt personal, like the city was showing me exactly where my family had landed while I was busy building my empire in Manhattan. The Sunrise Diner looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd learned about Christmas from a catalog printed in 1987. Tinsel hung in sad clumps from a plastic tree that had seen better decades, and a handwritten sign in the window wished everyone happy holidays, with an apostrophe that made my college-educated brain twitch. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, watching through the streaked windows. The dinner crowd, if you could call 3 tables of tired people picking at fried food a crowd, looked like they had nowhere else to be on Christmas Eve. Which, I realized, probably made it the perfect place for my sister to hide her daughter. When I finally walked in, the bell above the door announced my arrival with the enthusiasm of a death rattle. A waitress, who looked like she'd been working there since the Clinton administration, gave me the kind of look you give people who show up wearing clothes that cost more than her car. "Kitchen's about to close," she said. Not unfriendly, but not exactly welcoming either. "Just coffee," I said, sliding into a booth that had seen better decades. "Black." She poured something that looked like coffee, but smelled like burnt regret. "You waiting for someone?" Before I could answer, I heard a crash from the kitchen, followed by a string of words that would have made my business associates blush. The waitress rolled her eyes. "Emma, you okay back there?" Emma. My niece was here, somewhere behind that swinging door, and from the sound of things, she was having the kind of night that ends with broken dishes and broken dreams. "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson," came a voice I recognized, but hadn't heard in 3 years. It was older now, tired in a way 17-year-olds shouldn't sound. "Just dropped a tray." Mrs. Patterson looked at me with the expression of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people's intentions. "You know our Emma?" "She's my niece." Something shifted in her face. Not exactly suspicion, but close. "You're the rich brother." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't said like being the rich brother was necessarily a good thing. In neighborhoods like this, I supposed, being rich made you either a savior or a villain, and the jury was still out on which one I was going to be. "I'm the brother who hasn't seen his family in 3 years, I said, which felt like the more honest answer. Mrs. Patterson studied me for a long moment, then made a decision that seemed to involve wiping down the already clean counter and raising her voice just enough. "Emma, honey, you've got family here." The silence from the kitchen stretched long enough that I wondered if Emma had climbed out the back window. Then the swinging door opened, and my niece emerged wearing a uniform that was 2 sizes too big and an expression that was equal parts shock and horror. 3 years had turned my gangly 14-year-old niece into someone I almost didn't recognize. She was taller, leaner, and carried herself with the kind of careful control that comes from learning early that the world doesn't care about your feelings. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to look neat. And her hands, I noticed her hands immediately, were red and chapped from dishwater and industrial soap. "Uncle Will," she said, and I could hear her calculating exactly how much trouble she was in. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, apparently." I gestured to the empty booth across from me. "Sit." She glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded toward the coffee pot. "Go on, honey. I'll cover the kitchen." Emma poured herself a cup of coffee with movements that were too practiced, too automatic for someone who should have been worrying about prom dresses and college applications. When she sat down across from me, I could see the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like an old injury. "So," I said, going for casual and probably missing by miles, "this is where you spend your Christmas Eves now?" "Someone has to." The words came out sharper than she'd probably intended, followed immediately by a look that said she was sorry for the tone, but not the sentiment. "What about school?" Her laugh was the kind that didn't have any humor in it. "What about it? Emma, you were supposed to graduate in 6 months. You had college plans. You had—" I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass dreams and futures and all the things 17-year-olds were supposed to worry about instead of rent money and medical bills. "I had a lot of things," she said quietly, staring into her coffee like it might have answers floating around the bottom. "Then Mom got sick." The simple statement hit harder than any accusation could have. Then Mom got sick. As if that explained everything, excused everything, made everything else. College, dreams, futures, suddenly irrelevant. "How long have you been working here?" 3 months. She looked up at me, and I saw my sister in the stubborn set of her jaw. Since Mom couldn't hide it anymore, since Dad started picking up double shifts and still couldn't make the numbers work, since someone had to do something. Someone had to do something. Christ. She was 17 years old, and she was talking like the weight of the world was her personal responsibility. "Your parents know you're here? They know I have a job. They don't know—" She gestured around the diner, with its cracked vinyl seats and the smell of grease that had soaked into every surface. "They think I'm tutoring kids after school." Another lie to protect pride. Another sacrifice made in silence. It was like looking at a smaller version of Sarah, already learning that love sometimes meant swallowing your own dreams to save someone else's life. "Emma, this isn't your job. Taking care of your parents, paying for medicine, working in places like this, none of that is supposed to be your responsibility." She looked at me with eyes that were too old, too tired, too wise about how unfair the world could be. "Then whose job is it, Uncle Will?" "Yours?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Because the truth was, it should have been mine. It should have been mine 3 years ago, when I'd walked out of Sarah's house after our fight about money and pride. It should have been mine 4 months ago when she was diagnosed and too proud to call. It should have been mine every day since I'd made my first million and decided that being successful was more important than being family. But instead of admitting that, I did what I always did when conversations got too close to the truth. I changed the subject. "Tell me about the college applications," I said, because focusing on Emma's future felt safer than examining my own failures. The way her face shut down told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "There aren't any college applications." "Emma, you were honors track. You were talking about pre-med, about Johns Hopkins, about—" I stopped, because the expression on her face was making it clear that I was talking about someone who didn't exist anymore. "What happened?" "What happened?" she said carefully, like she was explaining something to someone who spoke a different language, "is that college costs money. Even with scholarships, even with financial aid, it costs money we don't have. Money for applications, money for housing, money for books, money for food, while I'm sitting in lecture halls instead of working." She picked at the handle of her coffee cup, and I noticed her nails were bitten down to the quick. A nervous habit she'd never had as a kid, so I made a choice. Mom needs medicine. Dad needs help with the bills. I need to be here. not in some dorm room 3 states away, pretending I don't know my family is falling apart. The matter-of-fact way she said it made my chest tight. This wasn't a teenager being dramatic about unfair circumstances. This was someone who'd done the math, looked at the numbers, and decided that her dreams were a luxury her family couldn't afford. What if the money wasn't a problem? She laughed, and this time there was some actual humor in it, though it wasn't the kind that made you feel good. Uncle Will, when has money ever not been a problem? When has our family ever been the kind that gets rescued by rich relatives who swoop in and fix everything? Fair point. I'd made my fortune, built my empire, and spent 3 years proving that success and family were mutually exclusive territories. Why should she believe I was any different now? Maybe things could be different this time. Different how? You write a check, Mom's pride gets hurt, Dad feels like a failure, and you disappear for another 3 years? She shook her head. Thanks. But we've managed this long without charity. Charity. There was that word again. The one that had started the fight 3 years ago. The one that had built the wall between us. The one that turned help into insult and love into obligation. It's not charity when it's family. It is when family shows up once every few years to judge how we're living and offer solutions that come with strings attached. Ouch. Direct hit. The truth was, I probably deserved that, and worse. But sitting across from my niece in a diner that smelled like broken dreams and desperate choices, I was starting to understand that this wasn't about my guilt, or Sarah's pride, or the stupid fight that had kept us apart. This was about Emma washing dishes on Christmas Eve, instead of wrapping presents. This was about a 17-year-old girl carrying adult responsibilities because the adults in her life, including me, had failed her in different but equally spectacular ways. What time do you get off? Midnight. Mrs. Patterson likes to close early on Christmas Eve, but someone has to clean the kitchen. She glanced toward the back, where the sound of scraping pans and running water had been providing background noise to our conversation. Why? Because I'm driving you home. I can take the bus. Emma, it's Christmas Eve. You're 17 years old. You should be at home with your family, not scrubbing dishes in a place like this. She looked around the diner, at the tired decorations, the worn-out furniture, the customers who probably had nowhere else to go on Christmas Eve, and something in her expression softened. These people need somewhere to go tonight. Mrs. Patterson needs someone she can count on. And my family needs the money I make here. So no, Uncle Will, I shouldn't be home. I should be exactly where I am. The way she said it, not defensive, not angry, just stating facts like they were weather conditions you had to work around, made me realize I was looking at someone who'd grown up faster than anyone should have to. But it also made me realize something else. Emma wasn't just working to pay bills. She wasn't just sacrificing her future for her family's present. She was doing it with a sense of purpose, of dignity, of choice that reminded me of someone. She reminded me of Sarah at 17, stubborn, proud, determined to take care of everyone around her, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. And just like with Sarah, I was about to do something stupid and stubborn and probably wrong. But unlike 3 years ago, this time I was going to stick around long enough to deal with the consequences. Okay, I said, standing up and pulling out my wallet. I'll wait. Uncle Will, you don't have to. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. Not this time. I left a $50 bill on the table, probably 3 times what my coffee cost. But Mrs. Patterson had been kind to my niece, and kindness deserved to be rewarded. Emma stared at the money like it might disappear if she looked away. I'll be in my car, I said. Take your time. As I walked toward the door, I heard Mrs. Patterson say something to Emma that I couldn't quite catch. But I caught Emma's response, and it made me stop with my hand on the door handle. I don't know, Mrs. P. He says he's not going anywhere, but people like him always do. People like him. Rich people. Successful people. People who showed up when it was convenient and disappeared when it got complicated. People like me. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of my niece going back to work, and made a decision that was either going to fix everything or destroy what little family I had left. I was going to prove her wrong. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching Emma through the diner's greasy windows. She moved like someone who'd been doing this job for years instead of months. Efficient, focused, invisible in the way that people who work service jobs learn to be. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the parking lot, probably checking to see if I'd given up and left. People like him always do. Yeah. Well, maybe it was time for people like me to surprise everyone. At 5 minutes past midnight, Emma emerged from the diner wearing a coat that had seen better winters and carrying a backpack that looked like it was held together with determination and duct tape. She approached my car like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. I rolled down the passenger window. Need a ride? You're still here. I said I would be. She studied my face for a long moment, then opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. The interior of my BMW was probably worth more than her family made in 6 months, a fact that hung in the air between us like an accusation. Nice car, she said, and I couldn't tell if she meant it or if she was commenting on the obscenity of leather seats that cost more than most people's rent. It gets me where I need to go. Where do you need to go that requires heated seats and a GPS system that probably speaks 3 languages? Smart girl? Too smart for her own good, probably. Mostly just back and forth between my apartment and my office, occasionally to visit family members who hate me. She snorted. An actual laugh, small but real. Mom doesn't hate you. She just thinks you're an arrogant jerk who judges people by their bank account balance. And what do you think? She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. I think you're here at midnight on Christmas Eve, sitting in a diner parking lot, waiting to give your niece a ride home. So either you're not as much of a jerk as Mom thinks, or you're a really dedicated jerk. Probably a little of both. We drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the city rolling past the windows like a movie neither of us was really watching. It was only when we turned onto her street that Emma spoke again. Can I ask you something? Shoot. Why now? Why show up now after 3 years of nothing? It was a fair question, and she deserved a better answer than the truth, which was that I'd been feeling guilty and lonely and middle-aged, and Christmas had made me sentimental enough to think I could fix 3 years of damage with some expensive wine and good intentions. I missed you, I said instead, which was also true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. I missed all of you, and I was tired of being angry about things that don't matter anymore. Mom's pride matters to her. Mom's pride is going to kill her if she doesn't let someone help. Emma went very still beside me. What do you mean? Shit. I'd said too much, assumed too much. Maybe Mark and Sarah hadn't told Emma how bad things really were. Maybe they were still trying to protect her from the worst of it. Emma, how much do you know about your mom's condition? I know she has lupus. I know the medicine is expensive. I know Dad works doubles, and I work nights, and we still can't make it work. Her voice was getting smaller, younger. I know she tries to hide how bad it hurts, but sometimes I hear her crying when she thinks no one's listening. I pulled up in front of the house and put the car in park, but I didn't turn off the engine. This conversation needed to happen, but not here. Not in front of a house where her parents were probably lying awake wondering where she was and how much trouble they were all in. The medicine she needs. It's not just expensive, Emma. Without it, lupus can cause organ damage, kidney failure, heart problems. It can be... I stopped, because 17-year-olds shouldn't have to think about their mothers dying. But she was already thinking about it. I could see it in her eyes. She's going to die. It wasn't a question. Not if she gets the treatment she needs. Not if someone helps. Someone like you. Someone like me. Emma leaned back against the headrest and closed her eyes. In the dim light from the street lamp, she looked like a little girl again. Like the niece who used to build forts in my living room and ask me to read her stories about princesses who saved themselves. What would you want in return? Nothing. Uncle Will, nobody gives away that kind of money for nothing. What would you want? The question caught me off guard, probably because I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on the problem. Sarah was sick. Emma was destroying her future. My family was falling apart, that I hadn't considered what came after the solution. I want you to go to college. I can't. I want your mom to get better, but I want your family to stop falling apart because everyone's too proud to ask for help, and I'm too stupid to offer it the right way. Emma opened her eyes and looked at me. And what do you get out of it? Maybe I get to stop feeling like a complete failure as a brother and an uncle. Maybe I get to be part of a family again, instead of just the rich guy who sends expensive Christmas cards from a distance. She was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. You hurt her before. When you left. When you said those things about Dad not being good enough to take care of us, about how we'd never amount to anything if we didn't accept your help. You hurt her, really, badly. I remembered that fight. I remembered saying things I'd regretted immediately, things born from frustration and fear, and the kind of arrogance that comes from confusing success with wisdom. I'd wanted to help, but I'd made it about what was wrong with their choices instead of what was right about their intentions. I know. If you do this, if you help us, you can't disappear again when it gets complicated. You can't decide we're not worth the trouble if Mom gets proud, or Dad gets defensive, or I mess up somehow. You have to stay. Emma, promise me you'll stay. I looked at my niece. Really looked at her. She was 17 years old, working midnight shifts to pay for her mother's medicine, asking her uncle to promise he wouldn't abandon them again. She shouldn't have had to grow up this fast, shouldn't have had to learn this early, that adults make promises they don't keep, and love comes with conditions. But she had learned it. And now she was asking me to prove that maybe, sometimes, adults could surprise you. I promise. Okay, she said, and opened the car door. Okay. She was halfway to the house when she turned back. Uncle Will? Yeah? Thank you. For waiting. For the ride. For... She gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything that had happened in the past few hours. For not being the kind of person Mom thinks you are. Emma? Yeah? You're going to make an amazing doctor someday. She smiled then. The first real smile I'd seen from her all night. It was Sarah's smile, bright and stubborn, and absolutely convinced that everything was going to work out somehow. Yeah, she said. I am. I didn't go back to my hotel that night. Instead, I drove around Cleveland until the sun came up, thinking about promises and pride and the ways families break apart when they love each other too much to ask for help. By the time I pulled into a 24-hour diner for coffee and a plan, I'd made 3 decisions that would either save my family or destroy what little relationship we had left. First, I was going to pay for Sarah's treatment. Pride be damned. Second, I was going to make sure Emma got to college, even if I had to drag her there myself. Third, I was going to do both things without making them feel like charity cases, which meant I needed to figure out a way to give them what they needed without taking away what they valued most, their independence. The diner was the kind of place that catered to shift workers and insomniacs, people who needed coffee and eggs at 6 a.m. on Christmas morning. I sat in a corner booth, working on my 3rd cup of something that might have been coffee in a previous life, when my phone rang. Mark's number appeared on the screen. Will? Where the hell are you? Sarah's been up all night worrying about Emma, and Emma won't tell us where she was or who she was with. If you've done something to upset that girl... Mark, slow down. Emma's fine. She's home, she's safe, and I drove her there myself around midnight. Silence. Then, you were at the diner. I was at the diner. More silence. Then, quieter. How much did she tell you? Enough. How long has she been working nights to pay for Sarah's medicine? I heard Mark sit down heavily, could picture him at their kitchen table, probably holding his head in his hands. 3 months. We tried to stop her, tried to tell her it wasn't her responsibility, but she's stubborn. Gets it from her mother. And how long have you been letting your daughter sacrifice her future? Because you're too proud to call your rich brother-in-law for help. Will, how long, Mark? Since the diagnosis, since we realized the insurance company considers effective treatment to be a luxury item. Since I picked up every extra shift I could find, and it still wasn't enough. His voice was raw, tired. Since I had to choose between my daughter's college fund and my wife's life. God, I'd been sitting in my Manhattan penthouse, complaining about quarterly reports and merger negotiations, while my family was making impossible choices about life and death and dreams. Is Sarah awake? She's always awake. Pain doesn't sleep. I'm coming over? Well, it's Christmas morning. I know what day it is. I also know your daughter is washing dishes instead of opening presents, And your wife is dying because she's too proud to ask for help, and you're working yourself to death trying to hold everyone together. So yes, Mark, I'm coming over on Christmas morning to have a conversation we should have had 4 months ago. I hung up before he could argue. 30 minutes later, I was standing on their front porch again, this time carrying a different kind of present. Not the guilt-wrapped bottles of expensive wine or the carefully chosen gifts that screamed, "I have money and you don't." This time, I was carrying a folder full of papers that represented the beginning of a solution. Sarah answered the door wearing a robe that hung loose on her shrinking frame and an expression that was equal parts resignation and defiance. "Emma told me you two had an interesting conversation last night." "We did. She also told me you made her some promises." "I did." Sarah stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled like coffee and Christmas morning, the kind of warm family smell that my expensive apartment had never managed to achieve. "Are you here to keep them or break them?" "I'm here to keep them, but I need your help." That got her attention. Sarah had been expecting charity, ultimatums, or lectures about pride and practicality. She hadn't been expecting to be asked for help. What kind of help? I sat down on their worn couch and opened the folder. Inside were medical forms, insurance papers, and a treatment plan I'd spent 3 hours on the phone arranging while the rest of Cleveland slept. The kind where you let me fix the insurance problem without fixing your pride problem. Sarah and Mark exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that comes from 20 years of marriage and 3 months of crisis. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a job. A real job, with real responsibilities and real health insurance that covers experimental lupus treatments without calling them experimental." Sarah sat down across from me, moving carefully. "What job?" "My company has been looking for someone to head up our new charitable foundation. Someone who understands what it's like to need help and be too proud to ask for it. Someone who knows how to make people feel dignified instead of desperate." It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd been thinking about starting a foundation for years, had even mentioned it to my lawyer a few times. The fact that I'd decided to make it a reality at 6 a.m. in a diner while drinking terrible coffee was just a detail. "The salary," I continued, sliding a paper across their coffee table, "would be enough to cover your treatment, Emma's college expenses, and a few other things you might have been putting off." Sarah looked at the number and went very still. "Will, this is too much. This is what someone with your experience in managing difficult people and impossible situations is worth." I leaned forward. "Sarah, you've been running this family like a CEO runs a company, making hard decisions, managing resources, keeping everyone focused on the mission. The only difference is you've been doing it without getting paid." Mark was staring at the papers like they might be written in a foreign language. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You'd be working for me, which means you'd have to put up with my personality on a regular basis. You'd be helping other families who are going through what you're going through right now. And you'd be doing it all while taking care of your own health first, because that's not negotiable." Sarah was crying. Not the dramatic sobbing kind of tears, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from holding everything together for so long that you'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else carry some of the weight. "This isn't charity," she whispered. "No," I agreed. "This is family. This is what we should have been doing all along." Emma appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by the sound of her mother crying. She looked at the papers, at her parents' faces, at me sitting on their couch offering solutions instead of judgment. "Does this mean I can apply to medical school?" "This means," Sarah said, wiping her eyes and standing up straighter than I'd seen her stand since I'd arrived, "that you can apply anywhere you want. And your uncle is going to help you with the applications." "I am?" "You are," Sarah said firmly, "because that's what family does." Emma launched herself at her mother, then at Mark, then, to my surprise, at me. The hug was fierce, grateful, and completely without reservation. "Thank you," she whispered against my shoulder, "for keeping your promise." As I sat there, holding my niece while my sister and her husband planned their first Christmas morning without fear in 4 months, I realized something I'd been too successful and too stubborn to understand before. I hadn't come here to save them. They'd saved me. But that realization, and everything that came after it, would have to wait. Because outside snow was starting to fall, And inside, my family was together again for the first time in 3 years. And sometimes, that's all the Christmas miracle you need. If you think Christmas miracles solve everything in 30 seconds, like a greeting card commercial, you've never tried to rebuild a family that's been broken by pride, poverty, and 3 years of stubborn silence. The papers were signed, the job was real, but the hard part was just beginning. Sarah's first day as Director of Community Outreach for Harrison Industries was scheduled for January 3rd, which gave us 8 days to navigate the delicate dance of family members who suddenly had to figure out how to be related to each other again. 8 days to convince Sarah that accepting help wasn't surrender. 8 days to convince Emma that her future mattered as much as her family's present. 8 days to convince myself that I wasn't making the same mistakes I'd made 3 years ago, just with better packaging. The first test came on December 26th, when Sarah called me at 7 a.m. with panic in her voice. "Will, I can't do this." I was drinking coffee in my hotel room, going through emails that seemed increasingly pointless after the past 2 days. Do what? Any of it. The job, the insurance, letting you pay for things. Mark's been up all night doing math, trying to figure out how much we'll owe you if this doesn't work out. Ah, there it was. The fear that lived underneath the pride. The fear that accepting help meant accepting debt, accepting obligation, accepting the possibility of failure on someone else's dime. Sarah, you don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. That's the problem. I set down my coffee and tried to figure out how to explain something I was still learning myself. What if I told you that helping you helps me too? I'd say that sounds like something rich people tell themselves to feel better about their guilty consciences. Fair point. Also, probably true. At least partially. What if I told you that I've spent 3 years being successful and miserable, and the past 2 days have been the first time in longer than I can remember that I felt like I was actually doing something that mattered? Silence on the other end of the line. Then, I'd say that sounds like something you should have figured out before your family was desperate enough to take your help. Ouch. Direct hit. My sister had always been good at finding the exact words that would cut deepest. "You're right," I said. I should have called when you were diagnosed. I should have swallowed my pride and called you. I should have been a better brother, and a better uncle, and a better human being. But Sarah, we can't fix the past 3 years. We can only decide what we're going to do with the next 3. Another silence. Longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. "What if I'm not good at this job? What if I can't help other families the way you think I can?" And there it was, the real fear. Not that she'd be indebted to me, but that she'd fail. That she'd prove right every voice that had ever told her she wasn't smart enough, educated enough, successful enough to matter. Sarah, you've been managing crisis situations and impossible budgets and difficult personalities for 17 years. You've kept your family together through job losses and medical emergencies and everything else life has thrown at you. You think corporate crisis management is harder than what you've already been doing? Corporate crisis management doesn't involve my daughter's future, or my husband's pride, or my own life. No, I agreed. It just involves other people's daughters and husbands and lives. People who need someone who understands what it feels like to be drowning and too proud to call for help. People who need someone who knows the difference between charity and dignity. I could hear her thinking, weighing options, calculating risks the way she'd been doing for months. If this doesn't work, it'll work. But if it doesn't, then we'll figure out something else. Sarah, I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out together. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with 3 years of history and the weight of promises that had been broken before. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. But Will?" "Yeah? If you make me regret trusting you again, I will find a way to make your life miserable that doesn't require being rich or successful or anything other than really, really creative about revenge." I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in days. Noted. "And Sarah?" "Yeah? I love you too." Emma's college application process turned out to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated, but not for the reasons you'd expect. The girl who'd been washing dishes at midnight to pay for her mother's medicine had somehow maintained a 3.9 GPA while working 30 hours a week. Her SAT scores were in the 95th percentile. Her essay about overcoming adversity made my assistant cry when I asked her to proofread it. The problem wasn't Emma's qualifications. The problem was Emma's guilt. "I can't go to Johns Hopkins," she announced on December 28th, sitting in my hotel suite where we'd been working on applications for the past 6 hours. "It's too expensive, even with financial aid." "Emma, we've been through this. The money isn't a problem anymore." "It's not about the money, it's about—" She gestured vaguely, trying to put words to feelings that were bigger than her ability to articulate them. "It's about leaving. It's about being 4 states away while Mom is still getting treatments and Dad is still figuring out how to not work doubles every week. It's about getting to have dreams while they're still cleaning up the mess from the past 4 months." I looked at my niece, really looked at her. She was 17 years old, brilliant, determined, and absolutely convinced that her happiness was somehow incompatible with her family's well-being. "Emma, do you know why your mom got sick?" She gave me a look that suggested I might have sustained brain damage between yesterday and today. "Because lupus is an autoimmune disease that—" "No, I mean, do you know why it happened now? Why she got diagnosed when she did?" "Lupus doesn't work on a schedule, Uncle Will. It's not like she penciled it into her calendar between my junior year and college applications. Smart girl, too smart for her own good, and definitely too smart to be easily distracted from inconvenient truths. What I mean is, do you think there might be a connection between your mom pushing herself to work extra shifts to save money for your college fund and her immune system deciding to attack itself?" Emma went very still. "That's not how autoimmune diseases work. Isn't it? Stress doesn't affect immune function? Exhaustion doesn't make people more susceptible to illness? Working 70-hour weeks to pay for your daughter's future doesn't take a toll on someone's health?" "Stop it. Emma, stop it. You don't get to make this my fault. You don't get to make Mom getting sick about my college fund or my future or anything I did or didn't do." Her voice was rising, getting sharp with panic and anger. I'd hit a nerve, the guilt she'd been carrying that was bigger than just working at the diner, bigger than just sacrificing her college plans. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't get to do that. Because it's not your fault. It's not your fault that your mom got sick. It's not your fault that medical treatments cost more than working families can afford. And it's not your fault that you've been trying to save everyone for the past 4 months." Emma was crying now. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd shed in the diner, but the messy, frustrated sobs of someone who'd been holding everything together for too long. "But if I go to college, if I leave, who's going to make sure she takes her medicine? Who's going to drive her to appointments when Dad's at work? Who's going to—" She stopped, choking on words that were too big, too overwhelming. "Who's going to take care of everyone?" She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Emma, do you know what your mom told me yesterday when I asked her what she was most afraid of?" She shook her head. "She said she was afraid that you'd grow up thinking love meant sacrifice, that you'd think being family meant giving up your dreams to fix other people's problems. She said she was afraid she'd raised you to believe that taking care of yourself was selfish." Emma looked up at me with eyes that were red and swollen but starting to clear. "She said that? She said that watching you throw away your future to pay for her medicine was worse than any physical pain the lupus had caused. She said that if you didn't go to college because of her, she'd never forgive herself." The silence stretched between us while Emma processed this information. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but determined. "What if something happens while I'm gone? Then we'll handle it. Your parents and me, working together like we should have been doing all along. What if the treatments don't work? Then we'll find different treatments, better doctors, more options. What if you change your mind about helping us?" There it was, the fear underneath all the other fears. The fear that this was temporary, conditional. Too good to be true. "Emma, I'm going to tell you something I probably should have told you 3 years ago, and definitely should have told you before now." I leaned forward, making sure she was listening. "I don't just love your family because we're related. I love your family because you're the kind of people who work midnight shifts to pay for someone else's medicine. Because you're the kind of people who'd rather struggle than accept help that might hurt someone's pride. Because you're the kind of people who think dreams are luxuries you can't afford when someone else is suffering. I paused, trying to find the right words for what I needed her to understand. But Emma, those same qualities that make your family extraordinary, they're also going to change the world if you let them. The compassion you feel for your mom, the determination you've shown these past few months, the intelligence you've been hiding behind dirty dishes and kitchen grease. That's exactly what the world needs more of. That's exactly what medicine needs more of. Emma was listening now, really listening, in the way that 17-year-olds listen when adults finally stop talking at them and start talking to them. So no, I'm not going to change my mind about helping your family. And yes, you're going to Johns Hopkins, because the best way to take care of the people you love isn't to sacrifice your future for their present. It's to build a future big enough for everyone. The first real test of our new family dynamic came on New Year's Eve, when Sarah had what the doctors politely called an episode, and the rest of us called the night we thought we were going to lose her. It started with what seemed like a routine lupus flare, joint pain, fatigue, the kind of symptoms that had become unfortunately familiar over the past few months. But by 10 p.m., Sarah was running a fever that wouldn't break. And by midnight, Mark was driving her to the emergency room while Emma and I followed behind in my car. You want to know what fear tastes like? It tastes like the metallic silence in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m., watching your brother-in-law pace the same 6 feet of linoleum while your niece sits perfectly still in a plastic chair, staring at nothing and everything at once. The doctor said it might be an infection, Mark said for the 4th time. Like repetition could make the words less terrifying. Something about her immune system being compromised by the treatment. Something about, he trailed off, because none of us really understood what the doctors were saying. We understood serious and monitoring and the next 24 hours are critical. But the medical terminology just sounded like a foreign language for things too scary to say in plain English. Emma hadn't spoken since we'd arrived at the hospital. She'd answered the nurse's questions about insurance and emergency contacts with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that staying busy was better than thinking too hard about outcomes you couldn't control. She's going to be okay, I said, though I had no medical training and no special insight into Sarah's condition. Sometimes the only thing you can offer is certainty, even when you don't feel it yourself. You don't know that, Emma said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said in 3 hours. No, I agreed. I don't know that, but I know your mom. And I know she's stubborn enough to fight through anything. I know she's not going to miss seeing you graduate from medical school. Emma looked at me with eyes that were too old, too wise about how quickly everything can change. What if this is because of the stress? What if starting the new job, dealing with insurance changes, all the stuff that's happened since Christmas? What if we made her worse? And there it was. The guilt that had been building since Christmas morning. The fear that accepting help had somehow caused more problems than it solved. Emma, lupus doesn't work that way. This isn't about stress or change or anything we did or didn't do. This is about an autoimmune disease that attacks randomly and unpredictably. And the only thing we can do is make sure she has the best possible medical care when it happens. Which she has now because of you. Which she has now because we're family. And that's what family does. Mark stopped pacing and sat down heavily in the chair next to Emma. She was getting worse before Christmas, before any of this started. She was hiding it, trying to protect us from knowing how bad it really was. The doctor said if we'd waited much longer to start the new treatment, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We all understood what "if we'd waited much longer" meant. At 6 a.m., Dr. Reeves emerged from the ICU, looking tired but not defeated. In hospital time, tired but not defeated was practically a celebration. "She's stable," he said, and I watched the tension drain out of Mark's shoulders like someone had released a pressure valve. The infection responded to antibiotics faster than we expected. Her kidney function looks good. Liver enzymes are normal. And the lupus markers are actually better than they were last month. Better? Emma asked, speaking for all of us. The new treatment is working. This infection was a setback, not a progression of the underlying disease. With proper monitoring and a few adjustments to her medication regimen, there's no reason to expect this kind of episode again. Mark started crying. The quiet, exhausted tears of someone who'd been holding his breath for 6 months and could finally exhale. Can we see her? She's asking for all of you. Fair warning, she's tired and a little disoriented from the medication, but she's definitely Sarah. We found her in a hospital bed that made her look smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But her eyes were clear and annoyed in a way that was completely, reassuringly familiar. "Don't you dare look at me like I'm dying," she said before any of us could speak. I had an infection, not a death sentence. Emma launched herself at the bed, careful of IV lines, but not careful enough to hide her relief. Mark kissed Sarah's forehead and whispered something that made her smile. The first real smile I'd seen from her since Christmas. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Like I got hit by a truck driven by someone who really didn't like me," Sarah said. "But alive. Definitely alive." She looked around at all of us. Her husband, who'd aged 5 years in one night, her daughter, who'd spent 6 hours imagining the worst possible outcomes, her brother, who'd driven to 3 different hospitals until he found one that could handle lupus complications. "We're going to be okay," she said. And this time, it wasn't hope or determination or wishful thinking. It was a promise. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my office in Manhattan, trying to concentrate on a merger proposal that would normally have my complete attention, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Mr. Harrison, there's a young woman here to see you. Says she's your niece?" I looked up to find Emma standing in my doorway, wearing a Johns Hopkins sweatshirt and carrying an expression that was equal parts determination and nervous energy. "Emma, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school?" "It's Saturday," she said, stepping into my office like she belonged there. Which, I realized, she did. Family belonged anywhere family was. "And you decided to spend your Saturday on a train to New York because—" She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the chair where CEOs and board members and people worth more money than most small countries usually sat. She looked completely comfortable, completely unimpressed by the view of Central Park, or the artwork that cost more than most people's houses. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you weeks ago." The serious tone in her voice made my chest tight. "Okay." Emma took a deep breath, like someone preparing to jump off a cliff. "I lied to you. About college, about my grades, about a lot of things." The bottom of my stomach dropped out. "What kind of lies?" "The night you found me at the diner? I wasn't just working to help with Mom's medical bills. I was also trying to pay back money I'd borrowed." "Borrowed from who?" Emma's hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "A loan shark. A guy who hangs around the high school, offers quick cash to kids who need it for family emergencies." Jesus Christ. "How much money, Emma?" $3,000. At 20% interest per week. I did the math in my head and felt sick. 20% weekly interest on $3,000 meant she'd owe nearly $4,000 after just 1 month, over $5,000 after 2 months. It was the kind of debt that destroyed families, destroyed futures, destroyed lives. "Emma, why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I could handle it myself. Because I didn't want you to think I was stupid or reckless or—" She stopped, taking another shaky breath. "Because I didn't want to give you a reason to change your mind about helping us." The pieces were falling into place now. The panic in her eyes that first night, the way she'd flinched when I'd mentioned her future, the desperate calculation behind every decision she'd made. "Who is this guy? This loan shark? His name is Danny Kozlov. He operates out of a check-cashing place near the school. Uncle Will, you can't call the police. If he finds out I told someone, if he thinks I'm trying to get him in trouble." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew what happened to people who crossed loan sharks, especially teenage girls who couldn't pay their debts. "How much do you owe him now?" "As of yesterday? $4,700. I pulled out my checkbook and started writing. Emma watched me with a mixture of relief and terror. "Uncle Will, you can't just pay him. It doesn't work that way. He doesn't want the money paid off early. He makes more money if I keep making minimum payments forever." "Emma, I've been dealing with bullies and extortionists my entire professional life. They come in expensive suits and call themselves consultants, but the principle is the same. They only have power if you let them scare you." I finished writing the check. For $10,000, not the 4,700 Emma owed. Sometimes you had to send a message that said you weren't just solving a problem, you were eliminating it entirely. I'm going with you to pay this off. Uncle Will, I'm going with you, Emma. This conversation is not negotiable. 2 hours later, we were standing in the most depressing check-cashing place in Cleveland, facing a man who looked like he'd learned customer service from watching gangster movies. Danny Kozlov was exactly what you'd expect from someone who preyed on desperate teenagers. Overweight, undereducated, and possessed of the kind of smug confidence that came from never having been challenged by anyone who could actually fight back. "Well, well," Danny said when he saw Emma walk in. "Look who decided to show up. You're late on this week's payment, sweetheart." "She's here to pay off the loan," I said, before Emma could respond. Danny's eyes shifted to me, taking in the expensive suit, the confident posture, the general aura of someone who had lawyers on speed dial. "And you are?" "I'm the guy who's going to make this problem go away permanently." I pulled out the check and placed it on his desk. Danny looked at the amount, and his expression shifted from smug to confused to nervous. "This is too much. Consider the extra a convenience fee for the inconvenience you've caused my niece over the past few months." Danny picked up the check, studied it like he was looking for hidden cameras, then looked back at me. "You know, your niece here, she's got a real talent for getting in over her head. Might find herself needing money again real soon." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. And it was exactly the opening I'd been hoping for. "Danny," I said, my voice friendly and conversational, "I'm going to explain something to you, and I want you to listen very carefully. My niece is going to Johns Hopkins University in the fall. She's going to become a doctor. She's going to save lives and make the world better. And if you or anyone like you ever approaches her, or any other kid at her school, or anywhere else in this city, I'm going to make it my personal mission to ensure that every regulatory agency, every law enforcement organization, and every investigative journalist in Ohio knows exactly how you've been operating." I leaned forward slightly, making sure he understood that this wasn't bluster. "I have lawyers, Danny, really good ones. The kind who specialize in financial crimes and consumer protection. The kind who consider guys like you to be professional development opportunities. Are we understanding each other?" Danny's face had gone from confident to pale to genuinely frightened. He nodded quickly, folding the check and putting it in his shirt pocket. "We're good. No problems here. Excellent. Emma, are we finished here?" Emma nodded, looking like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. As we walked back to my car, she was quiet for so long I thought she might be in shock. "Uncle Will?" "Yeah? When you said you'd been dealing with bullies your whole professional life, did you mean that literally?" I laughed, the tension of the past hour finally releasing. "Emma, the corporate world is full of Danny Kozlovs. They just wear better suits and have nicer offices. The principle is the same. They only have power if you let them intimidate you, and you never let them intimidate you." "Oh, I let them try. It's more fun that way." Emma grinned, the first completely carefree smile I'd seen from her since Christmas Eve. "I think I'm going to like having you as an uncle." 6 months later, I stood in the parking lot of Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, watching Sarah walk out under her own power for the first time since New Year's Eve. She was moving slowly, carefully, but she was moving. Her hair had grown back in soft waves after the chemotherapy, and her face had color in it again. Not just the pale determination that had carried her through the worst months, but actual healthy color. "You know what the best part of this is?" she said, "Of settling into the passenger seat of my car. That your latest blood work shows you're in remission? That too. But also that I get to drive myself to work on Monday." Sarah had been running the Harrison Family Foundation from her hospital bed for the past 3 months, approving grants for families in medical crisis and developing programs that provided support without destroying pride. It turned out that my sister had a gift for understanding exactly what people needed to hear when their world was falling apart. How many applications did we get this week? 47, including one from a family in Detroit whose daughter is working 3 jobs to pay for her father's cancer treatment. Sounds familiar? It should. According to Emma's research, there are approximately 200,000 families in the Midwest alone dealing with some version of what we went through. Emma, My niece had spent her freshman year at Johns Hopkins, studying pre-med and working part-time for the foundation, conducting research on medical debt and family crisis management. Her first published paper, The Hidden Cost of Pride: How Family Dynamics Affect Medical Treatment Outcomes, had been picked up by 3 major medical journals. Speaking of Emma, she called this morning, Sarah continued. She wants to know if you're planning to embarrass her at graduation by crying. I'm not going to cry. That's what Mark said about her high school graduation. Fair point. I'd cried at Emma's high school graduation too, though I'd tried to disguise it as allergies. There was something about watching your niece give the valedictorian speech 6 months after you'd found her washing dishes at midnight that made grown men turn into sentimental idiots. How's Mark handling the empty nest thing? He started taking night classes, business management. Says he wants to understand what I'm doing at work well enough to have intelligent conversations about it. I smiled. Mark had spent 30 years working with his hands, building things and fixing things and taking pride in work that was honest and solid and straightforward. But he'd also spent the past 6 months watching his wife turn their family's crisis into a mission to help other families, and he wanted to be part of that in a more substantial way. And how are you handling the success? Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the city where she'd grown up, struggled, survived, and finally thrived. It's strange, she said finally. For so long, I thought accepting help meant admitting failure. I thought being family meant never asking for anything, never being a burden, never letting anyone see you at less than your strongest. She turned to look at me, and I saw my little sister again. Not the exhausted woman I'd found 6 months ago, but the girl who'd always believed she could save everyone if she just worked hard enough. But it turns out that family isn't about being strong enough to handle everything alone. It's about being brave enough to let other people help carry the weight. Took us long enough to figure that out. Took you long enough to stop being an arrogant jerk who confused money with love. Ouch! But fair. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, through neighborhoods that had gotten steadily better as Cleveland's economy recovered, past the community center where the foundation held its monthly support groups, past the high school where Emma had graduated 6 months ahead of schedule to start college early. Will? Yeah? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't shown up that Christmas? If you'd stayed in New York and sent another expensive bottle of wine instead of actually coming home? I'd thought about it more than I cared to admit. The math was simple and terrifying. Without the new insurance coverage, Sarah would have continued deteriorating. Without my intervention with Danny Kozlov, Emma would have gotten deeper into debt that could have destroyed her future. Without someone forcing them to accept help, my family would have kept sacrificing themselves for each other until there was nothing left to save. I think, I said carefully, that you and Emma and Mark would have found another way. You always do. You're the most resourceful, stubborn, determined people I've ever known. That's not what I asked. I think I would have lost you, all of you, and I think I would have spent the rest of my life being successful and miserable and wondering why nothing I accomplished ever felt like enough. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she'd used to comfort me when we were kids, and I was scared of thunderstorms or bad dreams. Well, she said, good thing you decided not to be an idiot forever. Good thing. As I pulled into the driveway of their house, the new house, in the better neighborhood, with the working furnace and the reliable plumbing and the backyard big enough for the garden Sarah had always wanted, I realized something that should have been obvious months ago. I hadn't saved my family. They'd saved me. But more importantly, we'd all learned that saving each other wasn't a one-time event. It wasn't something you did and then checked off your list of family obligations. It was something you chose to do every day, in small ways and large ways, with patience and humor and the kind of love that showed up even when it was inconvenient. Emma's graduation from Johns Hopkins was still 3 years away, but I was already planning to embarrass her by crying. Sarah's remission would require monitoring and maintenance for the rest of her life, but we'd face that together. Mark's business management classes would probably lead to bigger dreams and new challenges, and we'd support those too. Because that's what family does. Not just in crisis, not just when someone is washing dishes at midnight, or lying in a hospital bed, or facing down loan sharks in check-cashing places. Every day. In all the ordinary moments between the dramatic ones. In all the ways that matter most.